Why, hello there. I hope you're doing well. Today is another warm, wonderful day in Portland. I hope you're having some great weather where you are, and if you're having bad weather, I'm really sorry to hear that, especially those in Central Texas. You know how the freak weather can be there, and that is a real tragedy. That's not really what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about books. And over the past couple months, I've made a concerted effort to increase the diversity of the writers and characters that I've been trying to read. Um, and partly it's because I haven't always done a great job with that. I have some books that are written by women, and one of my favorite series from whenever I was younger um, is called Cold Fire Trilogy, and that's written by a woman. But the fact that I know, I know that, and that I can kind of look over my bookshelf and see how many books that I've read that are written by women, it is certainly an issue, and it's something that I think I need to address, and I've been trying to work on that over time. And I think that kind of started with some discussion in one of the coffee discords I'm a part of. I'm part of James Hoffman's Discord, and there's a lot of people who talk about books there, and they talk about the Ursula K. Le Guin and how impactful her books have been to them, especially the Dispossessed and a lot of the Earthsea books, which are fantastic. I didn't read any of those books when I was younger. My I don't think my dad was a big fantasy and fiction and sci-fi reader, but he really didn't read any women. I think he had a one or two Elizabeth Bear books, and but those were all maybe he did. I don't even really remember. Most of the books he had were written by men, and even like I would have expected something from Le Guin to have been on his bookshelf, considering all the other sci-fi greats that he had, like Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and he didn't really keep a lot of his books though, so maybe he he read it and just donated it. I don't know, but it definitely was a gap in that sort of space, and I think that he also read, it was the 70s, and whenever he was reading these books, it was also just white men were what was published. So there's a little bit of that going on, like just general selection bias. Um, but I really wanted to try and make an effort to change what I was reading, because I've heard good things about a number of books, and I also have been hearing a lot of people who have been upset by this. I remember the Nebula, one of the Nebula Awards. I think it was like 2014, maybe. Let me check. Yeah, the Sad Puppies tried to kind of destroy the Nebula Awards. I remember it really being most extreme um, in 2014. Maybe it was 2015. Yeah, on Wikipedia it says 2015, but yeah, it was a big deal where they tried to just push out a series of works just because they were written by people who were or had characters who were diverse. And I mean, I thought it was stupid, because, but I I don't think I really recognized I buy a lot of books. I'm one of those people who read a lot. I always have, and I recognize that I didn't. I mean, this was even 10 years later. And now I'm just saying this, but it's something that I need to change, and especially since both the audiences of books is really changing, and the group of authors who are being published are starting to change too. I think in sci-fi and fantasy it's a little bit slower, but I think that it's going to become more prevalent in sci-fi and fantasy, and not even just in the romantasy subgenre. I expect that it's going to be more and more popular. Like Martha Wells, her books are really popular right now with Murderbot. And of course, you have all the romantasy, which are all women authors, which have some variety of smut in them, but that's part of their allure in some ways. So I've the past couple months I've been really doing an effort of that, and part of what drove that was whenever I was thinking about the book to go with everything is tuberculosis, and that's where I thought of Love in the Time of Cholera, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I hadn't read his books. I haven't read a lot of these other greats that were not sci-fi. Like I'm well read in the fact that in a lot of the sci-fi world, and I'm reading a variety of nonfiction, but there's definitely a group of books that I've just not read. And then whenever I was reading One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, and then the subsequent book for American War by Omar El Akkad, which is in this video here, I think those books really hit home as to a reason why there's significant value in reading these books, and that's especially for someone like Akkad who wrote these books, and then who was from Cairo originally, and then moved to the United States and experienced a lot of things. I mean, he's my age, but he experienced an entire different world growing up, and he paid attention to things that I didn't have any need to. I mean, it just wasn't covered well in the news, or if it was covered, it was covered with a very specific spin that obfuscated culpability by the United States. And I think that it's kind of important that we read these other point of views, because it can reflect these broader issues back in America, if they decide to write from an American's perspective, like what Akkad did with the American War, or even if it's just bringing new light to things that America has been complicit in abroad. I think that that's something that's important too. I don't think that most Americans could really have written American War the way that Akkad did, because it really does require an outsider's perspective to say, here are these catastrophic events that America has supported through providing weapons or material support, or literal support in funding, or vetoing resolutions in the UN, and wrapping that and saying, well, how would Americans think about that if it was happening on their own soil by their own people? And it also kind of highlights just some of the gaps between what people like Trump and PragerU are trying to do. There's a Zoe B video where she talks about the sanitization of American history, which makes it look non-controversial and very straight-lined and, sanitary. Especially since a lot of the things that God is reflecting onto us, we did on American soil. We just did it against Native Americans, or we did it against enslaved black people, or we did it against during the original Civil War, which was an incredibly violent war. And most of the times that we think about the horrors that we've done in other countries, it's the atomic bomb, and we think about the horrors that we did when, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, I remember I think it was either middle school or like early high school that we read Hiroshima, and that was a really moving and shocking book. And there was a book that was written somewhat recently that was kind of built on that. There was a what if scenario that North Korea set a nuclear bomb off in California. They used the exact same quotes from the survivors of Hiroshima that book did. We really only focus on these big events. We don't really think about the quieter day-to-day horrors that are accomplished. Like, if you Noah Samsen published this video about the bombing of a Gazan cafe with a couple dozen reporters and just intellectuals, or I don't even know if they were intellectuals, just people just having coffee, and it was intentionally bombed. And that's a quiet catastrophe. That is very intentional, the decision to do that, and that was probably done with an American bomb. And it's also things like where we're not pushing Israel to open up borders to enable flour. Getting flour and water and all those sorts of things, and forcing Netanyahu to change things. So I think it's important to think about how other people can reflect the rest of the world back onto us in a way that is powerful and meaningful. I think with fantasy and sci-fi, a lot of it really has been flattened, especially fantasy by Tolkien's vision of a Eurocentric fantasy world. And I think that this is really, really a problem in the long term that we need to continue working on, and having more different voices published. So, like I said, I've been reading more books by Ursula K. Le Guin. Recently, this I would say since Christmas, I've read most of her bibliography. I'd read Lathe of Heaven and Left Hand of Darkness years ago, and then I read all of the Earthsea books and the Dispossessed, and I'm planning on reading The World as a Forest soon. And, I think that those are really interesting books because they really do a lot to tear down a lot of the gender dynamics of fantasy and sci-fi for the most part, because sci-fi, of course, is very male dominated in terms of characters or lead, main characters, and they're, with the Left Hand of Darkness, there's gender is really turned on its head in a lot of ways, and in terms of sexuality, that's turned on its head in The Dispossessed in a way that I'm sure was shocking to 60s and 70s America. And I really have been thinking a lot about these books because they are deconstructing things in a way that I think is useful to think about as I want to try and do more writing, and as I try to do more critical thinking of books as I'm doing these books in conversation. Having these sorts of different perspectives forces me to really consider what I'm reading and what I'm saying about it. And one of those, another author that I've really enjoyed lately has been M.L. Wong. I mean, I've only read two of her books, but I thought that they were both interesting in very different ways. Um, One way that's similar is that there's a very strong woman who chafes at her role in society and pushes the bounds against it, and but still, in some ways, is conforms to that society. Like the Sword of Kaigen, which I read very recently, is feels like it's a very Japanese inspired world. I'm assuming that because of the animes I've watched and some historical documentaries I've watched, but I'm relatively ignorant of traditional Japanese culture. I mean, there's a lot of stereotypes and I'd rather not get into those. And so I like the fact that she has a strong sense of what culture she's trying to write for and from for that book, and the both the limitations and strengths of that culture, and how the magic system really uh, both reflected the women characters and the men characters in interesting ways, and how it intertwined with the martial arts that are in the book, because I think that was really well done in a way that I don't think every magic system is well integrated in. I mean, it definitely was probably somewhat influenced by anime, where the magic system is built into the fighting system, but compared to Tolkien type books where magic is very soft and it's very ethereal in a lot of ways, this is very much not that. It's more, it feels a little bit closer to a Sanderson type magic system, where it's very well explained. It's very much understood in the world, and we kind of are learning the magic system by following a young warrior, and I think that works really well and shows the limitations of of the culture that it's in and the strengths of the culture that it's in. And I thought it was really interesting, and it really highlights gender differences and class differences that really does ask you to reflect on the real world, especially with the noble houses and the houses that make things for those houses. And then I've also read three books that take place in Africa, which I think is a relatively underexplored space for sci-fi and fantasy. I mean, the pair of books by Nnedi Okorafor, they're considered Afro futurism, but there's also a lot of fantasy elements to them, where you could almost think that it's similar to Shannara, where there's or I was also thinking, I think the Half-Blood Prince, I think it was. There was a Mark Lawrence book, I think it was, that takes place in the future where magic has been unleashed, and it feels very much along those lines, where technology was still there, but it's secondary to humanity, and a lot of it has been discarded, and there are spirits and things that are more spiritual and more magical that Western world just kind of pushes down and aside and doesn't think is real. I thought both Who Fears Death and She Who Knows are really fantastic books, and it really highlighted again a an area of the world that I'm not familiar with, and a genocide that I wasn't familiar with, that I don't really know that the United States did much to stop. I remember hand wringing about it, and there were memes and jokes about it, but it feels like that's something that we certainly could have done more. And now I think that this book is even these books are even more pertinent because the U.S. just shipped 8 people to South Sudan, which is a country that came out of the genocide, out of this civil war, and they're still fighting there. So, and I think it's also an interesting series because it also highlights the fluidity of cultures and locations in Africa in a way that I think someone who's from there can only articulate, because there is that blending of Arabic influence and African influence that are kind of colliding in Sudan, and in some ways there's a bit of a proxy war going on with the Arabic like royalty, like from Syria, funding the Islamic groups that are attacking and causing a lot of the issues in Sudan. And I think the other thing that it does is that it does a better job really capturing the cultural differences of these groups. I mean, because this person, the Nnedi Okorafor, grew up there, she understands who these 2 different groups are and how to represent them in a way that is meaningful, even though she certainly understood the Okeki group that she represented more clearly, but she definitely had an understanding of the other group, and she was sympathetic to them in ways that I thought was really, really valuable. And I just think back to the Warded Man series by, I guess, I forget what it's called, the Devil Demon Gate Saga or something, by Peter V. Brett, specifically the Desert Spear, where he goes into this desert community, and they have all these different beliefs, but it really felt shallow, like he kind of only half researched it and didn't really understand what he was doing. And I felt that even then I knew that it was not a great book, but I think compared to books that really have dug into it better, into those desert cultures, I think it was lacking. So, I also read The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, which at the time of reading it, I really thought that it was well rooted in her community, but I did learn after doing a little bit of research that she's I went to her website, that she's a white convert to Islam, and she wanted to create this world that was inspired by Islam for people in her community. And whenever someone converts, they usually are going to do that very strongly and to try and prove their conversion was true. And I think that I have no idea how well of a job she did, but I think that there was a lot of really interesting things in that book that certainly felt authentic, that didn't feel like poorly researched. It felt like there was an understanding of the influence of Islam across these numbers of different countries, the way that those countries interact with each other, and of course the magic system was based off of what some of the historical legends in that area. And then I also read the Butcher of the Forest by Premi Mohammed. I heard about this book from God, what's his name? I'm picturing his Blue Sky, Chuck Wendig. Yeah, he really was promoting this book and rooting for Muhammad to get more people reading it. And I think that she's actually a fun person to follow on Blue Sky. I follow I follow a number of authors on Blue Sky. She's a fun author. She calls herself a bug, which is always kind of fun. But she also has really good rapport with a number of different authors, and I think that's great to see. The broader writing community engaging with each other, especially lifting each other up. This book is short. It is more of a novella than it is a novel. In fact, two of the books were actually novellas. The She Who Knows is also a novella. And in some ways, it's kind of refreshing to read these shorter standalone books compared to a lot of the tomes that I've been reading, because it allows me to dip into different worlds a lot more easily. But I thought that this book was really tightly crafted, and it told a story without any fat. There was no wasted words or chapters or anything, and it was told in a way that really the story approached was told in a way that really benefited from being a short story, a short novella. I know the Fae is really popular with a certain reader community. I don't know if I'm that target. I usually don't want to read about fairies, and maybe that's a bias that I need to do some reflection on and understand why. It's popular. It's in a lot of places, and that's. I'm glad that people are finding niches that they like. There's nothing wrong with tropes and digging into them. This one specifically really digs into the horror side of the Fae, which I definitely enjoyed. It was, it wasn't like scary horror. It was body horror type thing, and just the unknown of what the Fae could do, and the lack of certainty around what the motivations of the Fae are. It really was a unique book. I haven't read anything quite like it. The main character was a middle-aged woman, which is a underrepresented character class in most fiction, or at least fantasy. I mean, most everyone is a young kid, and usually a young teenage boy. I'm guilty of that. In the main character in this book here, Ghost Legacy, is a 15-year-old boy. Although I do have a secondary protagonist who is a middle-aged woman that mentors him and trains him in magic. But I thought this Fae was more interesting than the Fae that was in like the Wise Man's Fear, which I really didn't like that book. I thought it felt like just a teenager's wet dream, all of the whole portion of it. I know that the main character is supposed to be considered somewhat of an unreliable narrator, but it just, I think Muhammad's book here really does a good job making the Fae seem like creatures to fear. And if you saw the Wheel of Time, the last season of it, where in the last episode where they meet the Fail, I think it was, that is kind of like what I imagine the Fae are in her world. And there was a lot of dread, and it was wonderfully successful. But the books that got me really thinking about this sort of topic and talking about diversity and the importance of it were two books. One that I had finished, and the other that I was in the middle of when I started writing this. The Black Heart Man by Nalo Hopkinson and Rake's Fall by Vajra Chandrasekhara. I'm sure I did not get that right. Chandrasekhara. Anyway, they are very much of the culture that they are written and where they take place. And for me, I really don't know where the line is between what's real culture that they're building on and what's what is their unique magic to them. Like, for example, the Blackheart Man takes place in the Caribbean, and there are two goddesses with like human faces and an alligator head on top, and they represent the ocean and this sea, like lake of pitch. And I'm sure that was pretty specific to the book, but there's also just a general sense of community and witchcraft and learning and cultural heritage that is passed down through song and dance and copying of books that feels authentic in a way that it could be from her culture. I mean, she's Hopkinson is from Jamaica. I don't know a whole lot about Jamaican culture. I do know that song and dance is very prevalent there, but I don't know how much of that translates into their beliefs on magic and religion and things like that. But there's definitely a streak of anti-colonialism in it that surely is from her upbringing in the Caribbean. And I mean this book was fantastic. It also had one of the most deeply flawed main characters that I have read. It's right up there with one of the characters from Fernando from Love in the Time of the Cholera, who I hated. Vic Jose isn't as vile, but he is not a great person. He doesn't take care of his family and his friends very well, and his stepdaughter, and he leads to it causes a whole lot of pain and heartache. But the one thing that I can say about him is that he is willing to accept punishment for the things that he does, and I think that is very different than a lot of other characters that are flawed. He recognizes that he needs to do better, and he grew a lot by the end and was willing to accept what his real role in society was, and I thought that was really great. And Rakesfall is from another culture that I'm incredibly ignorant of. I don't really know anything about Sri Lanka, and so I have no idea what is real in terms of like their historical beliefs in magic and witchcraft, and they talk about the Akashic record, which is this universal history of the entire universe that's written by and records everything that has ever happened. I don't know if that's real or if that's based off of like there was a movement in the 1890s, because I looked it up. I was curious about what it was. There was a bunch of white people who took that Sanskrit term and turned it into something with their general whole movement around seances. That's what it is. Whole movement around seances and stuff like that. But I definitely feel like there is, because this book spans so much time, that there is political commentary about what's going on in Sri Lanka right now, political commentary about what has happened in the past that I am completely ignorant of. I don't know anything about. I kind of know that there was a civil war in Sri Lanka. I mean, most places have had one, especially since it was colonized, and I actually learned because of this book that and I'm sure this is true, and especially since so one of the things that they bring up is that there were Sri Lankans who were taken by the Dutch East India Trading Company, and they use the actual Dutch name for it in the book, that were taken to Africa, and because the Dutch wanted to have slaves from different areas so that they didn't have local knowledge, and so they would take, you know, Sri Lankan somewhere else, and they would bring in African slaves to Sri Lanka. And it is kind of crazy the amount of horror that's been delivered on people by the Dutch East India Company, and the impact of things that we're dealing with, like the fact that there's, you know, in Zoran Mandandi is currently in the news because he put down that he was African American because he grew up in Africa, and he's you know, East Asian. You know, he could have, for all I know, his family could have been taken there as slaves, or they moved there for some other reason. I honestly don't know. This book is very interesting. It's a very windy, complicated book that weaves a number of stories together over millions of years. And I feel that you just kind of need to go along for the ride for the book. And I really think that this is something that people should check out. In some ways, it kind of feels like a Faulkner-esque book with some of the horror elements of it, but instead of the swamps of the deep south, everything is in the jungle of Sri Lanka. And I really did enjoy this book, even if it was one of the hardest reads I've had in a very, very long time. I think all of these books were fantastic, and I want to do more reading of books like this. I have a couple other books that I plan to read that I saw. Like, I found about at Rake's Fall, Blackheart Man, because of the Ursula K. Le Guin shortlist, and I'm glad that I saw that. I'm going to certainly read more books like this, and I think that it's good to push boundaries and to think about different ways stories can be written, because all of humanity has stories. All humanity has different ways of thinking about stories, and we're really giving us the short shrift of things if we don't take advantage of the rich history of other cultures. And I think America is especially bad at not embracing cultural history from other parts of the world that we can learn from. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any recommendations for books from, you know, variety of different authors, LGBTQ, you know, from various different countries, you know, translated texts, you know, classics from other parts of the world. I'd love to see that. Give me a like, follow, comment, subscribe. If you're interested in following me on Blue Sky, I'm at capsar.blueskysocial.com, I think. And I'm Capsar on Mastodon, if you want to try and find me on there. I think I'm on Threads, but I don't really use it. So, but, you know, if you have any feedback, I love feedback on this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you have a good day.